Hello, I'm Danielle Alarcón's editor at Riverhead Books, and having now worked with Danielle for some years, I do think he's the busiest person I know, and I also know that he is one of the most brilliant. The book he's here to discuss tonight, his new collection, The King is Always Above the People, is actually the second book that he published this year. Earlier this summer, he translated and published the Book of Emma Reyes, an extraordinary posthumous memoir by a Colombian artist. He's a co-founder and executive producer of Radio Ambulante, the Spanish-language podcast distributed by NPR. It's an essential place for storytelling throughout the Spanish-language world, including the US. It's been called the Spanish language, This American Life. And just last week, Radio Ambulante and Daniel teamed up with This American Life to hold a fundraiser for Puerto Rico, where they raised thousands of dollars for the country, which has been ravaged by hurricane. This is all in addition to creating and airing many episodes a season, with stories ranging from Peruvian firefighters to the politics of the Chilean soccer team to the aftermath of the recent earthquake in Mexico. Oh, and Daniel's a professor at the Columbia Journalism School, and he goes all over the world writing long-form journalism for places like the New York Times Magazine, pieces that shed light on places and people who don't always get written about. Since The King is Always Above the People just came out this week, after being longlisted for the National Book Award, I'm thrilled that others are now getting to read it and experience these places and people in Daniel's fiction. There was a wonderful review just yesterday that says, "The whole collection is about people who want to be free. Alarcón writes about them with a grayscale beauty that few writers can achieve or try to. His purpose isn't to approve or condemn or to liberate. He's writing to show us other people's lives, and in every case, it's a pleasure to be shown." This is something that echoes across Daniel's nonfiction writing, the stories that he tells on air, and in the fictional stories in this book. He shows us other people's lives, ones that we don't always get to see, people who fly under the radar, who are on the move, and it's a pleasure, an absolutely illuminating pleasure to see their stories. And it's a pleasure to work with Daniel and get to be a witness to his brilliance and to be a collaborator on his vision and genuine passion for storytelling. I urge you, not just as an editor and the person who's selling the book, but as a reader, to pick up a copy of his book and experience this all for yourself. And I know you'll enjoy this.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. I'm going to read the title story from my collection, The King is Always Above the People. It was the year I left my parents, a few useless friends, and a girl who liked to tell everyone we were married, and moved 200 kilometers downstream to the capital. Summer had limped to a close. I was 19 years old, and my idea was to work the docks. But when I showed up, the man behind the desk said I looked scrawny, that I should come back when I had put on some muscle. I did what I could to hide my disappointment. I dreamed of living home since I was a boy, since my mother taught me that our town's river flowed all the way to the city. My father had warned me, but still, I'd never expected to be turned away. I rented a room in the neighborhood near the port from Mr. and Mrs. Patrice, an older couple who had advertised for a student. They were prim and serious, and they showed me the rooms of their neat, uncluttered house as if it were the private viewing of a diamond. Mine would be the back room, they said. There were no windows. After the brief tour, we sat in the living room, sipping tea beneath a portrait of the old dictator that hung above the mantel. They asked me what I was studying. All I could think of in those days was money, so I said economics. They liked that answer. They asked about my parents, and when I said that they had passed on, that I was all alone, I saw Mrs. Patrice's wrinkled hand graze her husband's thigh, just barely. He offered to lower the rent, and I accepted. The next day, Mr. Patrice recommended me to an acquaintance who needed a cashier for a shop he owned. It was good part-time work, he told me, perfect for a student. I was hired. It wasn't far from the port, and in warm weather I could sit out front and smell the river where it opened into the wide harbor. It was enough for me to listen and know it was there. The hum and crash of ships being loaded and unloaded reminded me of why I had left, where I had come to, and all the farther places that awaited me. I tried not to think of home, and though I'd promised to write, somehow it never seemed like the appropriate time. We sold cigarettes and liquor and newspapers to the dock workers and had a copy machine for those who came to present their paperwork at the customs house. We made change for them, and my boss, Nadal, advised those headed to customs as to the appropriate bribe, depending on what item they were expecting to receive and from where. He knew the protocol very well. He'd worked for years in customs before the dictator fell, but hadn't had the foresight to join a political party when democracy came. His only other mistake in 30 years, he told me once, was that he hadn't stolen enough. There had never been any rush. Autocracies are nothing if not stable, and no one ever thought the old regime could be toppled. We sold postcards of the hanging. Right by the cash register, the body of the dictator swaying from an improvised gallows in the main plaza. In the photo, it is a cloudy day, and every head is turned upward to face the expressionless dead man. The card's inscription reads, "The king is always above the people." And one has the sense of an inviolable silence reigning over the spectators. I was 15 when it happened. I remember my father crying at the news. He'd been living in the city when the man first came to power. We sold 2 or 3 of these postcards each week. In the early mornings, I wandered around the city. Out in the streets, I peppered my speech with words and phrases I'd heard around me, and sometimes, when I fell into conversation with strangers, I would realize later that the goal of it all had been to pass for someone raised in the capital. I never pulled it off. The slang I'd picked up from the radio before moving was disappointingly tame. At the shop, I saw the same people every day, and they knew my story, or rather, the one I'd told them. A solitary, orphaned student from a faraway neighborhood. "When do you study?" they'd ask, and I'd tell them that I was saving up money to matriculate. I spent a good deal of time reading, and this fact alone was enough to convince them. The stooped customs bureaucrats in their faded suits came on their lunch break to reminisce with Nadal about the good old days, and sometimes they would slip me some money. "For your studies," they'd say, and wink. There were others, the dock workers, always promising the newest, dirtiest joke in exchange for credit in the store. Twice a month, one of the larger carriers came in, depositing a dozen or so startled Filipinos for shore leave. Inevitably, they all wandered into the shop, disoriented, hopeful, but most of all thrilled to be once again on dry land. They grinned and yammered incomprehensibly, and I was always kind to them. That could be me, I thought, in a year, perhaps 2, stumbling forth from the bowels of a ship into the narrow streets of a port city anywhere in the world. I was alone in the shop one afternoon when a man in a light brown uniform walked in. I'd been in the city 3.5 months by then. He wore his mustache in that way men from the provinces did, and I disliked him immediately. With great ceremony, he pulled out a large piece of folded paper from the inside pocket of his jacket and spread it out on the counter. It was a target from a shooting range, the crude outline of a man, vaguely menacing, now pierced with holes. The customer looked admiringly at his own handiwork. "Not bad, huh?" I bent over the sheet, placing my index finger in each paper wound, one by one. "Depends. What distance?" "At any distance, can you do better?" he asked. Without waiting for me to respond, he took out an official-looking form and placed it next to the bullet-riddled paper man. "I need 3 copies, son. This target and my certificate, 3 of each." "Half an hour," I said. He squinted at me and stroked his mustache. "Why so long?" The reason, naturally, was that I felt like making him wait. And he knew that, but I told him that the machine had to warm up. Even as I said this, it sounded ridiculous. The machine, I said, was a delicate and expensive piece of equipment newly imported from Japan. He was unconvinced. "And we don't have paper that size," I added. "I'll have to reduce it." His lips scrunched together into a sort of smile. "But thank God you have a new machine that can do all that. You're from upriver, aren't you?" I didn't answer him. "Which village?" "It's a town," I said, and I told him the name. "Have you seen the new bridge?" he asked. I said I hadn't, and this was a lie. I left before it was built. He sighed. "It's a beautiful bridge," he said, allowing himself to indulge briefly in the description, the wide river cutting through green rolling hills that seemed to stretch on forever. When he was done reminiscing, he turned back to me. "Now listen, you make my copies and you take your time, warm up that machine, read it poetry, massage it, make love to it, do what you have to do. You're very lucky, because I'm happy today. Tomorrow I go home and I have a job waiting for me at the bank. I'll make good money, and I'll marry the prettiest girl in town, and you'll still be here breathing this nasty city air, surrounded by these nasty city people." He smiled for a moment. "You got that?" "Sure," I said. "Now, tell me where a man can get a drink around here." There was a bar a few streets over, a dingy spot with smoky windows that I walked by almost every day. It was a place full of sailors and dock workers and rough men, the likes of whom still frightened me. I'd never been, but in many ways it was the bar I'd imagined when I was still back home, plotting a way to escape. dark and unpleasant and exciting, the kind of place that would upset my poor, blameless mother. I took the man's target and put it behind the counter. Sure, there's a bar, but it's not for country folk. You insolent little fucker. Tell me where it is. I pointed him in the right direction. Half an hour, he said. Have my copies ready. He noticed the plastic stand with the postcards of the dictators hanging and scowled. With his index finger, he carefully flicked them over so that they all tumbled to the floor. I let them fall. If I were your father, he said, I would beat you senseless for disrespect. He shook his head and left, letting the door slam behind him. I never saw him again. As it happened, I was right about that bar. Someone must have disliked the looks of him, or maybe they thought he was a cop by the way he was dressed, or maybe his accent drew the wrong kind of attention. In any case, the papers said it was quite a show. The fight started inside. Who knows how these things begin, but it spilled out into the street, and that's where he died. His head cracked on the cobblestones. An ambulance was called, but couldn't make it down the narrow streets in time. There was a shift change at the docks, and the streets were filled with men. Shortly after my encounter with the security guard, I wrote a letter home. Just a note, really, nothing much, something brief to let my parents know I was alive, that they shouldn't believe everything they read in the papers about the capital. My father had survived a stint in the city. Nearly 3 decades later, he still spoke of the place with bewilderment. He went there shortly after marrying my mother and returned after a year working the docks with enough money to build the house where I'd been raised. The city may have been profitable, but it was also frightening, an unsteady kind of place. In 12 months there, he saw robberies, riots, a president deposed. As soon as he had the money together, he returned home and never went back. My mother never went at all. In my note, I told him about the Patrices, described the nice old couple in a way that would put them both at ease. I would visit at Christmas, I promised, because it was still half a year off. As for the target and the dead man's certificate, I decided to keep them. I took them home the very next day and folded the certificate carefully into the thin pages of an illustrated dictionary the Patrices kept in their front room. I tacked the target up on my wall so that I could face it if I sat upright in bed. And one night, a storm rolled in, the first downpour of the season, and the rain drumming on the roof reminded me of home. I felt suddenly lonely, and I shut my left eye and pointed my index finger at the wall, at the man in the target, and I aimed carefully, and I fired at him. It felt good. I did it again, this time with sound effects, and many minutes were spent this way. I blew imaginary smoke from the tip of my finger like the gunslingers I'd seen in imported movies. I must have killed him a dozen times before I realized what I was doing, and after that, I felt a fidelity to that man and the target that I could not explain. I would shoot him every night before sleeping, and sometimes in the morning as well. One afternoon, not long after I'd sent my letter, I came home to find the girl from my hometown. Malena was her name, red-faced and teary in the Patrice's tidy living room. She had just arrived from the country, and her small bag leaned against the wall by the door. Mrs. Patrice was consoling her, a gentle hand draped over Malena's shoulder, and Mr. Patrice sat by, not quite knowing what to do. I stammered a greeting, and the three of them looked up. I read the expressions on their faces, and by the way Malena looked at me, I knew immediately what had happened. "Your parents send their best," said Miss Patrice, her voice betraying grave disappointment. "You're going to be a father," her husband added, in case there had been any confusion. I stepped forward, took Malena by the hand, and led her to the room in the back without saying a word to the Patrices. For a long while we sat in silence. There had never been anyone besides me in the room, except for that first time the Patrices had shown me the place. Malena didn't seem particularly sad or angry or happy to see me. She sat on the bed. I stood. Her hair had come undone and fell over her face when she looked down, which at first was often. "Did you miss me?" she asked. I had missed her body, her breath, her laughter, but it wasn't until she was in front of me that I realized it. "Of course," I said. "You could have written." "I did, eventually." "How long?" I asked. "It's been 4 months, and it's..." "Yes," Malena said in a stern voice, "it's yours." She sighed deeply, and I apologized. Malena had news. Who else had left for the city? Who had gone north? There were weddings planned for the spring, some people we knew, though not well. As I suspected, the murder of the security guard had been a big story, and Malena told me she herself hadn't been able to sleep, wondering what I might be doing, whether I was all right. She'd visited my parents, and they'd tried to convince her not to travel to the city, or at least not alone. "Your father was going to come with me," she said. "Why didn't he?" because I didn't wait for him. I sat beside her on the bed so that our thighs were touching. I didn't tell her that I'd met the victim, about my small role in his misfortunes, or any of that. Instead, I let her talk. She described the small cosmetic changes that our town had undergone in the few months I'd been away. There was talk of repainting the bridge. I nodded. She was showing already an unmistakable roundness to her. I placed the flat of my palm against her belly and then pulled her close. She stopped talking abruptly in mid-sentence. "You'll stay with me. We'll be happy," I whispered. But Malena shook her head. There was something hard in the way she spoke. "I'm going home," she said, "and you're coming with me." It was still early. I stood up and walked around the tiny room. From wall to wall, it was only 10 short paces. I stared at my friend in the target. I suggested we see the neighborhood before it got too dark. I could show Malena the docks or the customs house. Didn't you want to see it? What is there to see? The harbor, the river. We have that same river back home, she said. We went anyway. The Patrices said nothing as we left, and when we returned in the early evening, the door to their room was closed. Malena's bag was still by the front door, and though it was just a day bag with one change of clothes, once I moved it, the room felt even smaller. Until that night, Malena and I had never slept in the same bed. We pressed together and shifted our weight, and eventually we were face to face and very close. I put my arm around her, but kept my eyes shut and listened to the muffled sounds of the Patrices talking anxiously. "Are they always so chatty?" Malena asked. I couldn't make out their words, of course, but I could guess. "Does it bother you?" I felt Malena shrug in my arms. "Not really," she said, "but it might bother me if we were staying." After this comment, we were quiet, and Malena slept peacefully. When we emerged the next morning for breakfast, my landlords were somber and unsmiling. Mrs. Patrice cleared her throat several times, making increasingly urgent gestures at her husband until finally he set down his fork and began. He expressed his general regret, his frustration and disappointment. "We come from solid people," he said. "We are not of the kind who tell lies for sport. We helped settle this part of the city. We are respectable people who do not accept dishonesty. We are church people," Mrs. Patrice added. Her husband nodded. I had seen him prepare for services each Sunday with a meticulousness that can only come from great and unquestioned faith. A finely scrubbed suit, shirts of the most pristine white. He would comb a thick pomade into his black hair so that in the sun he was always crowned with a gelatinous shine. Now, whatever half-truths you may have told this young lady are not our concern. That must be settled between the two of you. We have no children ourselves, but wonder how we might feel if our son was off telling everyone he was an orphan. He lowered his eyebrows. "Crushed," Mrs. Patrice whispered. "Betrayed." "We do not doubt your basic goodness, son, nor yours." "Malena," I said. "Her name is Malena. As you are both creatures of the one true God, and he does not err when it comes to arranging the affairs of men, it is not our place to judge, but only to accept with humility that with which the Lord has charged us." He was gaining momentum now, and we had no choice but to listen. Under the table, Malena reached for my hand, and together we nodded. "And he has brought you both here, and so it must be his will that we will look after you, and we do not mean to put you out on the streets at this delicate moment because such a thing would not be right. But we do mean to ask for an explanation, to demand one, and we will have it from you, son, and you will give it if you are ever to learn what it means to be a respectful and respectable citizen in this city or in any other. Tell me, have you been studying?" "No," I said. "I thought not," Mr. Patrice said. He frowned and shook his head gravely and then continued. Our breakfast grew cold. Eventually, it would be my turn to speak, but by then I had very little to say and no desire to account for anything. Malena and I left that afternoon. First, I went to the shop to arrange my affairs, and after explaining the situation to Nadal, he offered to help me. He loved doctoring official paperwork, he said. It reminded him of his finest working days. We made a copy of the original certificate and then corrected it so that the name was mine. We changed the address and the birth date, typed the particulars of my height and weight on a beat-up Underwood Nadal had inherited from his days at customs. He whistled the whole time, clearly enjoying himself. "You've made an old man feel young again," he said. We reprinted the form on bond paper, and with great ceremony, Nadal brought out a dusty box from beneath his desk. In it were the official stamps he'd pilfered over the years, more than a dozen of them, including one from the Office of the Secretary General of the Patriotic Forces of National Defense, that is, from the dictator himself. It had a mother-of-pearl handle and an intricate and stylized version of the national seal. I'd never seen anything like it. A keepsake, Nadal told me, from an affair with an unscrupulous woman who covered him twice weekly in bite marks and lurid scratches and who screamed so loudly when they made love that he often stopped just to marvel at the sound. Like a banshee, he said. She maintained similar liaisons with the dictator, and according to the woman, he liked to decorate her naked body with this very same stamp. Nadal smiled. He could reasonably claim to have been in his prime, extraordinarily close to the seat of power. Of course, the king is dead, Nadal said, and me, I'm still alive. Each stamp had a story like this, and he relished the telling, where it had come from, what agency it represented, how it had been used and abused over the years, and to what ends. Though Malena was waiting for me, and we spent nearly 2 hours selecting a stamp, and then we placed the forged document and the target that I'd removed from my wall that morning in a manila envelope. This too was sealed with a stamp. Nadal and I embraced. There'll always be a job for you here, he said. Malena and I rode home that day on a groaning interprovincial bus. She fell asleep with her head on my shoulder, and when I saw the city disappear and give way to the rolling plains and gentle contours of the countryside, I was not unhappy. The next morning, I presented those documents at the bank in the town just across the bridge from mine. We've been needing a security guard, the manager said. You may have heard what happened to our last one. He blinked a lot as he spoke. You're young, but I like the looks of you. I don't know why, but I like the looks of you. And then we shook hands. I was home again. My son was born just before Christmas that year, and in March, the papers began reporting a string of bank robberies in the provinces. The perpetrators were ex-convicts or foreigners or soldiers thrown out of work since the democratic government had begun downsizing the army. No one knew for certain, but it was worrisome and new, as these were the sorts of crimes that had been largely confined to the city and its poorer suburbs. Everyone was afraid, most of all me. Each report was grislier than the last. A half hour upriver, 2 clerks had been executed after the contents of the vault had disappointed the band of criminals. They hit 2 banks that very day, shooting their way through a police perimeter at the second one, killing a cop and wounding another in the process. They were said to be traveling the river's tributaries, hiding in coves along the heavily forested banks. Of course, it was only a matter of time. The bank I worked for received sizable deposits from the cement plant once a week, and many of their workers cashed their checks with us on alternate Friday afternoons. Malena read the papers. She heard the rumors and cataloged the increasingly violent details of each heist. I heard her tell her friends that she wasn't worried, that I was a sure shot, but in private, she was unequivocal. Quit, she said. We have a son to raise. We can move back to the city. But something had changed. The 3 of us were living together in the same room where I'd grown up. She smothered our son with so much affection that I barely felt he was mine at all. The boy was always hungry, and I woke every pre-dawn when he cried and watched as he fed with an urgency I could understand and recall perfectly. It was how I'd felt when I left for the city almost exactly a year before. Afterward, I could never get back to sleep, and I wondered how and when I'd become so hopelessly, so irredeemably selfish, and what, if anything, could be done about it. None of my actions belonged to me. I'd been living one kind of life when a strong, implacable hand had pulled me violently into another. I tried to remember my city routines, but I couldn't. The rest of the world had never seemed so distant. By late summer, the gang hit most of the towns in our province. It was then that my father suggested we go out to the old farm. He would teach me how to use a pistol. I began to tell him that I knew, but he wasn't interested. You drive, he said. We left town on a Saturday of endless, oppressive heat. The road, nothing but a sticky band of tar humming beneath us. We arrived just before noon. There were no shadows. The rutted gravel road led right up to the house, shuttered and old and caving in on itself like a ruined cake. My father got out and leaned against the hood of the car. Behind us, a low cloud of dust snaked back to the main road, and a light breeze brushed over the grassy, overgrown fields but provided no relief. He took out a bottle of rum, drank a little, and pulled the brim of his cap down over his eyes. The light was fierce. He was 7 years old when my grandfather died, and my grandmother moved the family from this farm into town. He passed me the bottle. I handed him the weapon. He loaded it with a smile, and without saying much, we took turns firing rounds at the sagging walls of my grandfather's house. An hour passed this way, blowing out what remained of the windows and circling the house clockwise to try our onslaught from another angle. We aimed for the cornices just below the roof and hit, after a few attempts, the tilting weather vane above, so that it spun maniacally in the still afternoon heat. We shot the numbers off the front door and tore the rain gutter from the corner it had hung for 5 decades. I spread holes all over the facade of that tired house. My father watched, and I imagined he was proud of me. "How does it feel?" he asked when we were finished. We sat leaning against the shadowed eastern wall. The gun was still warm in my hand. "I don't know," I said. "You tell me." He took his cap off and laid it by his side. "You're no good with that pistol. You gotta shoot it like you mean it." "I don't mean it. It's all right to be scared." "I know," I said. "I am scared." "Your generation isn't lucky. This never would have happened before. The old government wouldn't have allowed it." I shrugged. I had a postcard of the dead general buried in my bag back home. I could show it to my father any time, at any moment, just to make him angry or sad or both, and sometimes just knowing this felt good. "Are you enjoying it?" he asked. "Are you enjoying being a father?" What kind of question is that? It's not a kind of question, son. It is a question. If you're going to take everything your father says as an insult, your life will be unbearable. "I'm sorry," he sighed, "if it isn't unbearable already." We sat, watching the heat rise from the baking earth. It seemed strange to have to deny this to my father, that my life was unbearable. I mentioned the bridge, its new color, but he hadn't noticed. He turned to face me. "You know, your mother and I are still young." "Sure you are," I said. "Young enough, in good health, and I've got years of work left in me." He flexed his bicep now and held it out for me to see. "Look," he said, "touch if you want. Your old man is still strong." He was speaking very deliberately, and I had the feeling that he'd been preparing the exact wording of what he said next. "We're young, but you're very young. You have an entire life to lead, and you can go if you want and look for that life elsewhere. Go do things. Go see different places. We can take care of the child. You don't want to be here, and we understand." "What are you talking about?" "Your mother agrees," she said. "We've discussed it. She'll miss you, but she says she understands." I stared at him. "And Malena? She'll want for nothing." I picked up the gun, brushed the dust off it. I checked to make sure it was unloaded and passed it back to him. "When?" I asked. "Whenever." And then we rode home and spoke only of the weather and the elections. My father didn't care much for voting, but he supposed if the owner of the cement plant wanted to be mayor, he could be. It was fine with him. It was all fine with him. The sky was filled with quilted white clouds, but the heat had not waned, or maybe it was how I felt. Even with the windows down, I sweated clean through my shirt, my backs and thighs sticking to the seat. I didn't add much to the conversation, only drove and stared ahead and thought about what my father had said to me. I was still thinking about it 2 weeks later when we were robbed. It was no better or worse than I imagined. I was asked to say something at the manager's wake, and to my surprise, the words would not come easily. I stood before a room of grieving family and shell-shocked friends offering a bland remembrance of the dead man and his kindness. I found it impossible to make eye contact with anyone. Malena cradled our son in our arms, and the evening passed in a blur until the three of us made our way to the corner of the dark parlor where the young widow was receiving condolences. She thanked me for my words. She cooed at our boy. "How old?" she asked. But before Malena or I could respond, her face reddened, and the tears came, and there was nothing either of us could say. I excused myself, left Malena with a kiss, and escaped through the back door. It was a warm evening. The town was shuttered and quiet. I could hardly breathe. I never made it home that night, and of course this time, Malena knew better than to look for me. Thank you.
Hi there. I recently had the pleasure of interviewing Salman Rushdie for a British newspaper. which puts me in something of a bind. If any of you are frequent readers of the British press, you'll understand that most British journalists feel compelled to display towards their subjects an attitude of mild disdain, if not derision. It makes us feel good about ourselves, which is tricky in the case of Salman Rushdie because he's actually not a bad writer. Over the last 40 years, his novels have ranged wildly in tone and geography and genre, but they have something in common that I would call a deep, resonating joyfulness, an extravagance, and a hunger that almost rises off the page in a fine mist. They colour decisively outside of the lines, and they invite us, the reader, to go with them on outlandish journeys and in the company of outlandish, sometimes grotesque people. In the case of The Golden House, his latest novel, an Indian family living in New York who contain entire worlds within them. A similar thing might be said of the author, who, as he put it to me during our interview, has the good fortune to have roots in 3 places, 3 cities which his soul might call home: London, New York, and Mumbai. Salman Rushdie arrived in London from India at the age of 13 to attend boarding school and left for New York 40 years later, having written, among other novels, Midnight's Children, one of the defining works of fiction of the late 20th century. Other novels followed: The Moor's Last Sigh, Shame, the great rock and roll novel The Ground Beneath Her Feet, and the one that caused all the bother, and may be amusing some of you, as it is me in its current form, as the basis of season 9 of Curb Your Enthusiasm. featuring Larry David's doomed Broadway musical, Fatwa. Salman's affection for New York is evident in his new book, which is a kind of love letter to downtown, and I suppose to the idea of America, the current administration notwithstanding, as a promised land. For many years, I think, the British establishment considered Salman rather a pain in the neck, and as far as I can tell, you guys have been more generous. He repays you, and all of us, by continuing to write his fiction, and to weather with good humour the use to which we and TV comedy writers put his extraordinary life. I wish I could salvage some professional pride and be slightly more downbeat about Mr. Rushdie, but I can't. It is simply really good fun to have him here with us tonight. Enjoy.
Thank you. So I'm going to read to you, just to introduce you to the main character of The Golden House, Nero Golden. I'm going to read you the very beginning of the book, and then I'm going to read you a couple of bits about the woman who ensnares him and what happens then. He wasn't expecting to be ensnared, I think. Anyway, this is the beginning of the book. On the day of the new president's inauguration, when we worried that he might be murdered as he walked hand in hand with his exceptional wife among the cheering crowds, and when so many of us were close to economic ruin in the aftermath of the bursting of the mortgage bubble, and when ISIS was still an Egyptian mother goddess, an uncrowned 70-something king from a faraway country arrived in New York City with his 3 motherless sons to take possession of the palace of his exile, behaving as if nothing was wrong with the country or the world or his own story. He began to rule over his neighborhood like a benevolent emperor, although in spite of his charming smile and his skill at playing his 1745 Guadagnini violin, he exuded a heavy, cheap odor, the unmistakable smell of crass, despotic danger, the kind of scent that warned us, look out for this guy, because he could order your execution at any moment, if you're wearing a displeasing shirt, for example, or if he wants to sleep with your wife. The next 8 years, the years of the 44th president, were also the years of the increasingly erratic and alarming reign over us of the man who called himself Nero Golden, who wasn't really a king, and at the end of whose time there was a large and, metaphorically speaking, apocalyptic fire. The old man was short, one might even say squat, and wore his hair, which was still mostly dark in spite of his advanced years, slicked back to accentuate his devil's peak. He dressed expensively, but there was a loud animal quality to him which made one think of the beast of folktale, uneasy in human finery. All of us, who were his neighbors, were more than a little scared of him, though he made huge, clumsy efforts to be sociable and neighborly, waving his cane at us wildly and insisting at inconvenient times that people come over for cocktails. He leaned forward when standing or walking as if struggling constantly against a strong wind only he could feel, bent a little from the waist. This was a powerful man, no more than that, a man deeply in love with the idea of himself as powerful. The purpose of the cane seemed more decorative and expressive than functional. When he walked in the gardens, he gave every impression of trying to be our friend. Frequently, he stretched out a hand to pat our dogs or ruffle our children's hair. But children and dogs recoiled from his touch. His skin was brown leather and his smile glittered with golden fillings. His was a raucous and not entirely civil presence. But he was immensely rich, and so, of course, he was accepted. But in our downtown community of artists, musicians, and writers, not on the whole popular. So that's enough about him, I think. He meets a Russian girl, and that thereby hangs the following tale. The book, by the way, is the first-person narrator of the book, who you'll meet in a minute, is a young 20-something filmmaker, young New Yorker, neighbor of his called Renee, who becomes friendly with the family and, as you'll see, slightly too involved with it. Here is Vasilisa, the Russian girl. She is striking. One might say she is astonishing. She has long dark hair. Her body is also long and exceptional. She runs marathons and is a fine gymnast, specializing in the ribbon element of rhythmic gymnastics. She says that in her youth she came close to the Russian Olympics team. She is 28 years old. Her youth was when she was 15. Vasilisa Arsenyeva is her full name. Her region of origin is Siberia, and she claims descent from the great explorer Vladimir Arseniev himself, who wrote many books about the region, including the one that became a Kurosawa film, Dersu Uzala. But this line of descent is not confirmed because Vasilisa, as we will see, is a brilliant liar, accomplished in the arts of deceit. She says she was raised in the heart of the forest, the immense taiga forest that covers much of Siberia, and her family was of the tribe Nanai, whose menfolk worked as hunters, trappers, and guides. She was born in the year of the Moscow Summer Olympics, and her heroine as she grew up was the great gymnast Nellie Kim, half Korean, half Tatar. 65 countries, including the United States, boycotted those Moscow Games, but in the depths of the forest, she was far away from politics, though she did hear about the fall of the Berlin Wall when she was 9 years old. She was happy because she had begun to look at a few magazines and wanted to go to America and be adored and send US dollars back to her family at home. This is what she has done. She has flown the coop. Here she is in America, in New York City, and also, now and often, in Florida. And she is much admired and making money doing the work the beautiful do. Many men desire her, but she is not looking for a mere man. She wants a protector, a czar. Here is Vasilisa. She owns a magic doll. When, as a child, and earlier, Vasilisa was sent by her wicked stepmother to the house of Baba Yaga, the witch who ate children, who lived in the heart of the forest, It was the magic doll who helped her escape so that she could begin her search for her Tsar. So the story goes. But there are those who tell it differently, saying that Baba Yaga did eat Vasilisa, gobbled her up the way she gobbled up everyone. And when she did, the ugly old witch acquired all the young girl's beauty, that she became outwardly the spitting image of Vasilisa the Fair, though she remained sharp-toothed Baba Yaga on the inside. This is Vasilisa in Miami. She is blonde now. She is about to meet her Tsar. So it's New Year's Eve in Miami, and Nero Golden and his family have gone to stay in a little elite spot off the coast off the tip of Miami Beach called Fisher Island. The Vanderbilt house is the heart of the island. Rewind. Here is William Kissam Vanderbilt II on his 250-foot yacht, making a swap deal with the developer Carl Fisher, the yacht in exchange for the island. Shake hands on that. Here is Bibi Rebozo, accused at the time of Watergate of being Nixon's bagman, joining a group that bought the island from the guy who bought the island from the guy who bought the island from Vanderbilt. The island has a history. It has an observatory. It has peacocks. It has discretion. It has golf. It has class. And this cold holiday season at the Vanderbilt house, after the New Year's Eve dance on the fine parquet outdoor dance floor laid down amid trees festooned with strings of lights and burning braziers and live music and women in their jewels and security guards guarding the jewels and the men who bought the jewels admiring their property, the island also has a much talked about winter and spring, November and April love affair. My money for your beauty. Shake hands on that. New Year is for dancing, and when the music stops, she commands Nero, go home and sleep. I want you rested for me when we really begin. And he obediently walks back to his bed like a good boy with his sons looking on in astonishment. This is not really happening, their looks say. He's not really falling for this. But such is his authority that not one of them speaks. The next night, he empties the apartment he has rented for himself and his 2 assistants, banishing employees and family to the other 3 rented accommodations where there are plenty of spare bedrooms. He is alone on the 7th floor looking down at the tops of the palm trees, the small half moon of beach, and the bright water beyond. Dinner has been delivered by motor launch from a fine dining establishment on the south side of the Miami River and has been set out on the dining table. There is ice and caviar and vodka and wine. At precisely the appointed time, not a minute earlier or later, she comes to his door, gift-wrapped in gold, with a bow at the back of her dress so that he can easily unwrap her. They agree that they do not want to eat. Here is Vasilisa the Fair, giving herself to her Tsar. The first and second night, the first 2 nights of the new year, she demonstrates her wares, lets him see the quality of what's on offer, not only physically, but emotionally. Perhaps she is kneeling beside him on the bed. Yes, kneeling, I think, asking, is this what you meant? Or this? Is this what you meant at all? He is the king. He knows what he wants. And everything you want, she says, when you want it, it's yours. And on the 3rd night, she discusses business. This is not a shock to him. This makes things easier. Business is his comfort zone. She produces a printed card the size of a postcard with boxes to tick. Let's go through the details, she says. Obviously, I should not stay in the house on McDougal. That is your family home for yourself and your sons, and I am not your wife, so I am not your family. So you can choose A, a residence in the West Village for convenience, for ease of access, or B, on the Upper East Side for a little distance, a little more discretion. Very well, B. This is also my preference. So the size of the apartment, 2 bedrooms minimum, no? And maybe 1 more as art studio space. Good. And will I own it, or is it a rental? And if so, for how many years? Okay, think about it. We proceed to the car. And I leave this to you completely. A, Mercedes convertible, B, BMW 6 Series, C, Lexus SUV. Oh, A, so nice, I love you. The question arises of where I will have accounts. A, Bergdorf, B, Barney's, C, both of the above. Fendi, Gucci, Prada, this goes without saying. Equinox, Soho House, every house, you see the checklist. The subject of a monthly allowance. I must comport myself in a manner that befits you. You see the categories are 10, 15, 20. I recommend generosity. Yes, in thousands of dollars, darling. Perfect. You will not regret it. I will be perfect for you. I speak English, French, German, Italian, Japanese, Mandarin, and Russian. I ski, water ski, surf, run, and swim. The flexibility of my gymnastic youth, this I retain. In the coming days, I will know better how to satisfy you than you know yourself. And if equipment is needed to assist this, if a room must be constructed, a room for us, let us call it a playroom, I will make sure it is done immaculately and with the greatest discretion. I will never look at another man. No other man will touch me, nor will I tolerate any inappropriate advances or remarks. You deserve and must have exclusivity, and it is yours, I swear to you. This is all for now, but there is one more matter for later. This is the matter of marriage, she says, lowering her voice to its huskiest and most alluring level. As your wife, I will have honor and standing. Only as your wife will I truly and fully have this. Until then, yes, I am happy. I am the most loyal of women, but my honor is important to me. You understand? Of course. You are the most understanding man I have ever met. So, then he's screwed. So a little later, when her plot is unfolding, she obviously doesn't just want to get married, she also wants children, and that's part of her plot, and this is where she turns for advice to the young man, the narrator, René, who's kind of closer to her age than anyone else in the story. It began in this way. Vasilisa asked me, as she sometimes would while I was a lodger in the Golden House, to accompany her on a shopping expedition to the high-end fashion emporia of Madison Avenue. Because I trust your taste, darling, she said, and Nero, all he wants is sexy, the more exposed the better, but that is wrong, isn't it? We know this. Sometimes concealed is more alluring than revealed. To tell the truth, shopping for clothes was among my least favorite pursuits. I bought my own clothes when I did, mostly online and quickly. In a fashionable store, my attention span was limited. For Vasilisa, however, the homes of exquisite dresses were her theater, and it fell to me to be her audience, applauding her entrances, back arched, looking over her shoulder at herself in the mirror, then at the human mirror that I represented, then at herself again, while a small gaggle of attendants applauded and cooed. And it was true, she looked exceptional in whatever she put on. She was one of the 200 or so women in America for whom these clothes were made. She was like a snake who could slip in and out of many different skins, slithering from this to that, with her little forked tongue licking at the corners of her lips, adapting herself and being adored, dressing as snakes do, to kill. That afternoon there was an extra brightness to her beauty, an overdazzle, as if she who didn't need to try at all in the looks department was trying much too hard. The assistants in many stores, the Fendivini, the Guccisti, the Pradalings, responded by being even more adulatory than was their professional wont. This she received as the minimum she was due. And after such adoration, on the 7th floor of Bergdorf Goodman, sweeping into the restaurant, first naming the staff, ignoring, but while ignoring also receiving, the admiring attention of thin, expensive women of various ages, taking her seat at her table by the window, Leaning forward with elbows on the table and both hands clasped beneath her chin and looking directly into my eyes, she asked the catastrophic question. Renee, can I trust you? Really 100% trust you? Because I need to trust somebody, and I think there's only you. This was, as the old Latin grammar books had it, a nonne question, one which expected the answer yes. These being the only questions Vasilisa Golden ever asked. Yes questions. Would you like to go shopping with me? Do I look okay? Can you zip me up? Do you think the house looks beautiful? Would you like a game of chess? Do you love me? It was impossible to say no, and so of course I said yes, but I admit I metaphorically crossed my fingers behind my back. What a young rat I was. Never mind, all writers are thieves, and in those days I was hard at work. Of course, I said, what is it? She opened her pocketbook and took out a folded letter and passed it across the table to me. Shh, she said. 2 sheets of paper from a medical diagnostic laboratory on the Upper West Side, the results of various tests on both Vasilisa and Nero Golden. She took back the page about herself. This isn't important, she said. With me, everything is 100% good. I looked at the remaining document in my hand. I'm not good at reading these documents, and she must have seen the confusion on my face and leaned in close across the table. Is a seminogram, she hissed. An examination of the seed. Oh. I looked at the various measures and comments. The words meant nothing. Motility, oligozoospermia, nice vitality. What does it say? I murmured. She sighed an exasperated sigh. Were all men this useless, even when discussing material so significant to their manhood? She spoke very quietly, mouthing the words exaggeratedly so that I could understand. It means he is too old to father a child. 99% for sure. Now I understood the strain she was under, which had had the effect of making her turn up her volume too high. She had made her big play and Nero had given in, and then this. It's like he did it on purpose, she said in the same very low voice. Except I know he doesn't know. He thinks he's a tiger, a machine. He can make babies just by looking at a woman in the wrong way. This will hit him hard. What will you do? Eat your Caesar salad, she said. We'll talk after lunch. There was snow on the ground in the park, and a homeless orator sounding off on the way to the carousel. I'm going to skip the homeless orator. I put a couple of dollars in the can at his feet and we moved on. I'll tell you what I'm going to do, Vasilisa said. I'm going to protect Nero from this information. And so, by the way, are you. Sit down here. We are going to doctor the form. We were at one of the tables by the carousel. Behind us, the carousel itself was shuttered for the winter. She got out her pen and methodically altered the handwritten figures. Motility, I, 1, Roman numeral, she said. That's bad. That means 0 motility. And without motility, there is no forward movement. You understand me? But if I put a little V after the I, so now it's motility 4, that's perfect. That's A-OK. And here, sperm concentration, 5 million per milliliter, very low. But now I put a little 1 before the 5, and 15 million, this is normal, according to the World Health Organization, I looked it up. And so on, here, 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 improvement, improvement, improvement. You see? Now he's fine. Now he is totally capable of fatherhood. She actually clapped her hands. The power of the smile of happiness spreading across her face was such that it could almost convince the person upon whom it was unleashed, me, that fiction was fact, that falsifying a diagnosis could actually alter that diagnosis in the real world. Almost, but not quite. That may take care of his ego, I said, but the baby won't arrive by stork, will it? Of course not, she said. What then? You'll pretend to go on trying for a while and then persuade him to adopt? Adoption is out of the question. she said. Then I don't understand. I will find a donor. A sperm donor? Yes. How will you get him to agree to that if he doesn't know his own sperm isn't working? He will never agree to it, she said. You'll get a sperm donor without telling him? How is that even possible? Aren't there documents that have to be signed? Isn't his consent necessary? He will never consent, she said. Then how? She reached across the table and took my hands in hers. My darling Renee, she said, that is where you come in. I'm going to stop. Thank you. Thank you. All right.
Thank you both. Just a few questions before they sign books. The first is for you, Salman. Are there particular challenges or pleasures to making a book with a setting that's as contemporary and as familiar as this one is?
Yeah, I mean, there are. It's something which, if you get taught how to write at creative writing school, which I never was, you get told not to do. You get told, don't write about the day before yesterday because you need distance and perspective and so on. And that's true. So it makes it riskier because if you do it wrong, then your book very rapidly becomes outdated like yesterday's newspapers. You know? And the hope is if you do it right, then you manage to capture a certain moment, you know, for all time, if you're lucky. So it's a gamble, it's a risk, but I think it's a risk worth taking.
And the pleasures, any?
Oh, the pleasure is that it's enormous fun.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, to be that interactive with what's going on and to try and be loose enough in the way in which you're approaching the text to be able to incorporate stuff that just happens, you know, whether it's cronuts, you know, or Occupy Wall Street, or whatever it might be, you know, to be able to sort of just try and smell what's in the air and what's going on and what's bugging people at the moment and try and make sure you get a hold of that. So that's fun.
Is there cronut research involved?
Yeah, I have to say I have never eaten a cronut, and that's okay.
This one is for Danielle. It says, how has Radio Ambulante's mission changed in the age of Trump? Second question is, what does your journalism do for your fiction and vice versa?
Well, the second question is easier, I think, to answer. I think that I can point to very clear examples of when I was stuck on a story or a piece of writing, and an assignment, a journalistic assignment, changed the course and the trajectory of that particular work. It often happens if you are assigned a 7,000, 8,000 word piece. You have to have 20,000 words to, you know, not written, but you have to be able to write 20,000 words. So what do you do with that extra 12,000 words? In my case, they sort of filter and change and transform and become the background or sometimes the germs of stories. So there's a very direct connection. The other connection is the process is very similar, and that sounds very weird, but if I go into a room and I'm in it's a real room, I'm just looking around and listening to people and trying to figure out the power dynamics between folks and observing. And when I go into fictional rooms, I do exactly the same things. And it's just really a process of listening. For me, fiction writing and journalism, they're just listening. The first question is a big one. I think that the president did a lot to make Latinos hit targets and make Spanish speakers targets, make immigrants targets, and so a show like ours that celebrates the diversity in the lives of Latinos and Latin Americans, you know, it has a different role now. I mean, we're telling stories and celebrating stories that you know, in the context of having been told that we're all rapists and murderers and drug dealers and that we should leave. So, you know, take of that what you will.
for Salman, it says, please tell us the Larry David story.
Well, I was very scared that I was going to be the only person on Curb Your Enthusiasm who wasn't any good. so there was that. But no, basically, I mean, I had met him a couple of times, and then he called me out of the blue and said, so I've written this thing, and you want to be in it? And I said, well, what thing? Can I read it? And he said, well, there's a problem about that, which is that there's no script. Because it's all improv. And I said, well, can you tell me about it? And he told me like 3 sentences. And I said, okay, I'll do it. That was about it. And then I had 2 very enjoyable days. You know, and I discovered that I was okay. I felt comfortable doing improv. And I think maybe one of the reasons is that if you're a writer who's been around for a while, you do an enormous amount of broadcast stuff. And it's all unscripted television. You know, you're being asked questions that you don't know what you're going to be asked, and you have to say something interesting in reply. And so in a way, you're doing improv, you know, all the time. And I think that gave me a little sense of confidence. Also, they're very good at making you feel good. But it is complete, like they sit you down and they say, okay, Larry's going to say, you're at lunch, you know, and Larry's going to say something like this, and you're going to really dislike it. Go. You know, there's one scene, I have to say, that there's one deleted scene, which if you go on the Curb Your Enthusiasm Facebook page, you can see, which is a bridge scene when we're leaving what's supposed to be my house, you know, with the butler and all that. and we're going to the restaurant. There's a brief scene where we're walking out of the house, and Larry says to me, he said, tell me something. He said, are there any female butlers? And I say, well, yeah, I mean, I guess there's a few. There must be some. Yeah, there's some female butlers. And he says, well, because that'd be better, wouldn't it? A female butler, because then there'd always be the possibility of sex. And I say, no, Larry, no, because there's a rule in the butlering world. And he says, what's that? And I say, don't fuck the butler. I was sad. I was proud of that line.
Last question, it's for Danielle. It says,
Don't fuck the butler. All right, got it.
it says, I'm a teacher at a school nearby. I'm planning on teaching your story, 3rd Avenue Suicide, next week. Any advice?
That's great. I used to be a teacher at a school not far from here also. I was a counselor at Academy of Environmental Science right up on the river 99th, and I worked at George Washington Houses, which is right up the street. So that's great. My first advice would be like, don't try to interpret the title, because that's a deleted scene. Actually, the title referred to a scene that is not in the story. This is a story from my first collection, and I really like the title, but when I deleted the scene, and then I kept the title and realized that the title made no sense. So that would be my first bit of advice. Second bit of advice, it's funny, I wrote that story so long ago. I remember, oh, now I remember. Yeah, you should come find me after when we're signing books. No, that's like, I think, the only autobiographical story in the collection. So there's that, which may or may not be interesting to your students, probably not. But yeah, good luck, and thank you for teaching wherever you are. In this dark thing, I can't see anybody. But thank you for teaching my story. That's very, very humbling.
Thank you, guys, and thank you all for coming.